Welcome back after lunch. What can we learn from the life of Queen Christina? Peter Englund has said that the fact that Queen Christina converted to Catholicism would be as if the daughters of Bush would turn to Islam. In her life, Queen Christina challenged and broke many of the ruling norms in her society. What can we learn from this today? One word that is striking when one read or hear about Christina is power. The positional power of the monarchy she was born to be, but also the way she took actual power, refusing to be only a symbolic monarch. Further, to what she used her power. And finally, the fact that she abdicated from position and power. As a leadership scholar, I can say that there is hardly any research on why people step down from a position. So she's really interesting. So what can we learn from Christina when it comes to power? A second thing that is striking in the story of Queen Christina is, of course, age. Christina was 6 years old when her father died, 18 when she became a queen, and 27 when she abdicated. In this, she broke norms, having power despite being young. What can we learn of Christina when it comes to power related to age? A third thing that sticks out when it comes to Queen Christina is the gender issue. It seems as she had an ambiguous sexuality. King Christina was biologically female, but was raised and educated as a boy, and in many ways she in her life behaved according to male norms. What can we learn of Queen Christina about power related to gender? Queen Christina is fascinating in the way that she broke several values and norms of her time about many things. In this seminar, we will focus on power, gender, and age. And we also want to translate the lessons we can get from this to today. What are the challenging norms of society that younger generations meet today? What ideals did Queen Christina stand for and act out in her way to break these norms? Can young people implement these ideals today? In short, the focus of this seminar is the question, how can the life of Queen Christina inspire us today regarding identifying and breaking norms about power, gender, and age? My name is Lina Lid-Falkman. I'm not a management specialist, as it says in the program. I have a PhD in social science at Stockholm School of Economics. My expertise is in leadership theory combined with rhetoric. So both these areas are very marinated with male norms. So Queen Christina is absolutely fascinating to me, since she was trained both in leadership and in rhetoric, which still are male-dominated. I am representing a gender committee, and there are more of us here, so I would like you to stand up. Madeleine Sundell here is the chairman. An applause. And then the rest of my members. Please stand up so you know they can talk to you afterwards. And we in the committee has invited 3 panelists to this seminar. So I'm very happy to welcome Birgit Sauer, professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Vienna. And she has been now for a couple of months a visiting researcher at Södertörn University. She has long, of course, an applause. Birgit has long experience in research on women and politics, specifically on gender equality policies in comparative perspective and on gendered theories of democracy and state. And then we have Stefano Fogelberg-Rota. Okay, you have to applaud now. Yeah? Good.
We know him already.
Stefano took his PhD in literature in 2008 at Stockholm University with a dissertation, Poesins drottning, Christina of Sverige och de italienska akademierna, the Queen of Poetry. During 2012, he's positioned in Paris, continuing to work on Queen Christina time, and we're happy that you could come to Sweden for this event. And finally, Erik Pettersson. Good, now you get it, after every person, yeah. Erik is a PhD student in history from University of Linköping. His thesis concerns care in the early modern state in Sweden, using the veterans' home in Vadstena as an example. Erik has written 4 books, and one of them about Queen Christina and her way to abdication, called Maktspelerskan, the Player of Power, and he has put it there in front of him. And I think we'll do like this. I'll give the panelists 10 minutes each to present their view on our topic, And then I have a bunch of questions, and I hope that you have a bunch of questions as well. And we'll talk about power and gender and age this hour. So let's start with Birgit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So we're welcome after the lunch break, and I'm talking a bit about being a political woman, the ambivalences and the paradoxes, and we have been talking about this already this morning. So the aim, what I'm going to do, I hope in the next 10 minutes, is to reflect on how we can interpret Queen Christina's life with respect to women and power today. So it's not that really what can we learn, but how can we interpret it? Is that okay, or is it better like that? So we could say modern political world, modern politics is a men's world. The Republican notion of politics since the French Revolution has developed as a male-dominated sphere where men play men's games about power, as the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu put it. Also, democratic politics can be described as masculinist and as androcentric, as an androcratic politics and not as democratic, so more about the sovereignty of men and not the sovereignty of the people. All over the world, women are underrepresented in political decision-making institutions, and also in a country like Sweden, where, for instance, the quantitative representation of women in parliament is rather high. Women in politics are still seen as different, and women's issues are not equally represented to the issue of men. So then, which lessons can we draw from Christina's life for women in political power today? And of course, we cannot straightforward compare Christina with female politicians today. So our reflections have to be sensitive with respect at least to two dimensions. The first dimension, of course, is the time dimension. So the regency of Queen Christina was rather different from modern politics. Her regency marks, we could say, the slow transition from medieval Ancien Régime to modern politics. So we could say that she was at the threshold to modern politics. But anyway, in Christina's time, politics was restricted to a small group of nobles, and the sovereign was not at all responsible or accountable towards the people. So this makes a huge difference to Republican or even to democratic politics. However, in the so-called early modernity of the 17th century, new forms of state organizations did emerge. And for instance, the Westphalian Peace, which Christina was pushing and negotiating, resulted in a total reorganization of state power across Europe. And the modern state, the so-called territorial state, the Westphalian state, emerged after that. So the second dimension, we have to be careful to interpret Christina with respect to modern politics, is the dimension of fictional construction, and we've been talking about this the whole day. But however, I want to point out that the biography of Christina has been to a large extent constructed in literature, in gossip, in lampoons, and of course then later in films. So we might not mix the real life with a constructed Christina and with all the representations of Christina. However, all these representations somehow feed into the public person of Christina. And so we could also say that these fictions are part of her, you could say, real life. So having said this, what are the important features we could look at in Christina's biography for recent debates on women in politics? What we could see is that Christina embodied the transformation of the political field from feudalism, from absolutism to modernity. And of course, then she embodied the role and position of women in this political field. In Christina's time, gender was not the most important required characteristics of governing a country. We talked about this this morning also. So it wasn't really a gender issue. Of course, the king was male at that time, and succession rules had to be changed for Christina's regency. However, much more important than gender was, of course, the dynastic background, and being of royal descent made Christina a political leader. So gender wasn't that important in politics at that time. However, her biography shows that in the 17th century, gender started to become a political category. And this gendering of the political field, so you could see the background, the noble background became more unimportant, but gender became more important in the political field. And this historical process had its peak, we could say, in the 19th century, when women were excluded from suffrage due to their gender, while at the same time, suffrage was expanded to all men, irrespective of their class background or their positioning. And so it is due to this political moment in history that Christina caused so much gender trouble in politics, because she was positioned at this threshold where gender became more and more important for politics. And this is why I think that all biographers have to stress her transgressive behavior. Christina transgressed the ancient times of sovereignty and leadership as a woman. At the same time, she transgressed notion of sex and gender, the sexual and genealogical order, and of course the state and power order of her time. And her transgressions show that and how modern male-dominated politics developed out of the old absolutist, but of course also male form of politics. And I briefly want to point to four of these transgressions. And the first is what I call gender troubles. So Christina was a woman who was aware of power, and she wanted to exercise power all of her life. Also, she wanted to exercise power, and she was very aware of it. So at least that's how got her biography. And we also can assume that Christina did not want to fit a female role image of being powerless or being only the object of male power games at the court. So therefore, Christina was portrayed with monarchic and masculine characteristics. She was confident, she was courageous, she was bold, intelligent, and proud, of course. Attributes of noble and powerful men. Hence, she also had to behave like a man, so she had to acquire a male gender. Like in a nutshell, we can see in Christina's life the precarious and ambivalent positioning and constructions of women in the political field. Women in politics are always transgressing the borders of their gender, and until today, they have to change their traditional gender role and becoming more masculine in order to demonstrate leadership. And femininity still is a sign of weakness in politics. But however, the thing is more complex because it's so paradox. And the paradox is that women in power are criticized for both, for being too masculine and for being too feminine. I don't know if you remember the tears of Hillary Clinton. There was much debate about her tears. There were occasions when she didn't cry publicly, so she was criticized for that. And then at another occasion, she broke out in tears, and she was criticized for this, for being weak and showing this weakness. So it's still a sort of lose-lose situation. And Christina's life tells us that the perception of women in modern politics is a relict of pre-publican, pre-modern age, and that the role of women in politics today still needs to be modernized, one could say. So the second issue I want to raise is the struggle over sex. Why did so many fantasies about Christina's sex and body develop? Christina's body became a battlefield for, one could say, hegemonic structures, constructions of a political leader. Such a powerful, such a lavish and extravagant sovereign as Christina was doubted to be a biological woman. And these doubts, you can find these doubts all over and all over again. So not only her gender role was contested, but also her sex, her female body was put into question. Christina was said to be a biological man, or at least intersexual. And while in ancient politics, the king had two bodies, so the king's body was separated, on the one hand, in the natural body, the biological body, and the eternal body of the king, so the powerful body. But we could see is in the person of Christina that the queen didn't have two bodies, or at least the two bodies were merged and they were not separated. And they were blended and collapsed into one body of Queen Christina. So doubting her sex, doubting her natural body, meant then also to doubt her ability to govern and to exercise power. Christina then was portrayed as the embodiment of sexual difference in power. And this paradox of politics hasn't been solved until today. Still, the body of female politicians is marked as different as the other body that does not fit, while the male body is not marked. It is still seen as normal. Women politicians are still confronted with the paradox of having a female body and a male gender. So the third and the fourth point, I only want to point out very briefly. This is third, the transgression of heterosexuality and of heteronormativity. It was the Christina's transgression, her lesbian relation was at the same time, you could see, a dynastic transgression. Her obstinate refusal to marry and her lesbian relations were not only personal or private preferences, but they were also an attack on the genealogy of the Vasa dynasty, and it resulted, one could say, if one want to stress it, the termination somehow of the dynasty. And also the fourth transgression, Christina's conversion to Catholicism, was not, I would say, a private decision, but it was also a political decision, because this act fundamentally challenged the foundation of Swedish state power. So she challenged with this conversion state power in Sweden. So we could see Christina as a female leader who, as a woman, challenged the foundation of power at her time. Or put it differently, she became a symbol for the grand transformation of politics at her time. So, and we could say maybe this might be the role of women in politics today, challenging the well-known foundations of political power, also in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birgit. And I cannot stop from thinking, so it was difficult for her to be, she was accused of being too male. And even today we have this, I think it's called double punishment, damned if you do and damned if you don't in gender theories. Even today, so nothing has happened in 300 years. How long time will it take? Or will it ever happen? We'll come back to that in the discussion. Stefano, welcome.
Thank you. Me on my side, I will try to focus more on the cultural ideals of Christina, trying to suggest that her deep patronage of the arts, her deep involvement for culture, could possibly stand as an example, even for young people today. Two of the many challenges Queen Christina was confronted with during her lifetime stands out as particularly demanding, and both occurred during her youth. First, how was she to interpret her role as queen during her 10 years on the throne of Sweden? She was 18th when her reign began, not exceptionally young for the time. Her father had, for instance, been declared major of age at 17th, and so Charles XI, but of course still very young. And second, how was she to establish her position as sovereign queen in Rome, thou not reigning, accorded to her by the Council of the Realm in her act of abdication? Christina solved both these crucial and difficult situations by means of what we today would call, in a very general sense, culture. Her deep interest for learning and the arts, poetry, music, theater, her patronage, and how she employed cultural strategies to solve both political issues. These are aspects of Christina's life that, even if trying not to be too anachronistic in my approach, I believe can still inspire young people of today. As we just heard, Christina's role as young female monarch was, during her education and the beginning of her reign at least, very much influenced by what we could generally define as male discourses, introduced by her surrounding. Christina was invited to put aside what were then considered the weaknesses of her sex and encouraged to adopt male behaviors in order to show herself to the world as appropriate for ruling. These aspects are particularly clear in the lavish court ballets performed during her reign. These highly propagandistic spectacles had in Sweden, as elsewhere in Europe, and especially in France, just think about Christina's contemporary, Louis XIV, the explicit purpose of conveying political messages under the veil of allegory. And probably Louis XIV is the most important example, how the image of, when we think of him today, is the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil. And this is very much due to the ballets in which he performed as the sun. The image of Christina as a virtuous maiden and monarch was expressed with such consciousness and insistence in the ballet preceding the beginning of her reign in 1644, that there can be no doubt about the propagandistic message behind these performances. These qualities were connected with a clear exhortation to marry, in order to give heirs to the throne, an invitation clearly put forward by the Council of the Realm. As we all well know, Christina refused this destiny to which she was deemed, and managed to have her cousin and sort of bridegroom, Charles Gustav, elected as a heir. This decision was first discussed in private deliberations, then officially in the Council of the Realm, but found the strongest expression on stage in the ballet performed at the Castle Tre Kronor, where we stand today. Christina's appearance on stage as Diana, the goddess of hunting and chastity, in the ballet Den fångne Cupido, the imprisoned Cupid, defeating the god of love, stood as the clearest possible argument for the queen's refusal of marriage. The ballet served Christina's aim of making believe natural and rational her choice. She appeared in front of a subject, as well as in front of all Europe, as a godlike character, governing by reason and free from the power of passions. Christina appeared thus as an heroic character, an image that stood close to the arguments used by her surrounding when inviting her to marriage. However, she managed to use the same argument by directing the meaning of the ballet on her advantage. And just a short excursus on heroism and heroic virtue, these completing virtues that Aristotle talks about in the Nicomachean Ethics as a virtue pertaining to the most distinguished individual and approaching man to the divine. These kingly ideals was, of course, closely related to nobility and is, therefore, I'm afraid, not particularly practicable in general for young people of today. These were used as a mean to introduce some sort of divinization of the Queen, legitimizing absolutism and its ideals. Heroic virtue has nonetheless not only an ancient character and context, but found even important religious implications. Christina's heroic character appears, in fact, as an element of constancy between her Swedish and her Italian time, an ideal that had not only to do with military deeds. She would use, in fact, to describe, she will rather better to say that in her academy, the academicians were invited to discuss on heroic matters, to describe her own Christina's offer of the crown, an heroic offer of the crown for the sake of Catholicism. This is in fact the core of the activity of a Roman academy, Accademia Reale, founded in its final form in 1674, which had two main activities, poetry and learned discussions. And obviously, the core of the praise of Christina was her conversion to Catholicism. But the Academy had also the function of a sort of political platform, we would say today, for her claims as sovereign queen in the papal city. Not even in this case, I would say, Christina's example as Catholic convert appears to me as generally appealing for younger generations in Sweden and in Europe. Still, the ways in which Christina, through culture, achieved her political aims, or better, the political ambitions pertaining to her cultural patronage, are aspects that I think can inspire us today. Cultural patronage was for Christina a way to legitimize her position and power, first as young queen in Sweden, and then as a sovereign monarch, thou not reigning. In other words, if I should try to describe it in another way, we could say that through patronage, through culture, Christina actually tried to shape her own world. Of course, patronage is common to many other kingly personalities, and we just mentioned Louis XIV. But as it was suggested this morning, I would say that patronage found another dimension with Christina, and she stands literally between the patron and the author, I would say. The engagement of her cultural interests are so strong that you could say that she's not only supporting cultural activities and events, like we could think about some sponsorship today. She's really involved in what is occurring around her. Maybe, as suggested before, because she was a woman, and in part had to affirm her in different domains than, for instance, the battlefield. She could not, for example, assert her position on the battlefield as her father or cousin, even if she likes to remember his contemporaries and us of the fact that she would have been good in leading the army, and how she regrets greatly to having missed the chance. If compared to politicians nowadays that in time of economic crisis reduce, first of all, expenses for culture, in 17th century Europe, these expenses were regarded as highly necessary. The very same stability of the country depending on the image of the monarchy, of what image the monarchy was able to convey of itself. Though these premises are very different between then and today, politicians, and especially young leaders, that want to mark a difference between them and their predecessors should, nonetheless, invest in culture, just as Christina did. This would lead, it's not only a question about image, this would lead, as we know, to a more just, competent, and rich society in every aspect. Here lays, in my opinion, the actuality of Christina's legacy, even for young generations. the power of culture to change actually the realities that surrounds us. And with these words, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. And my thought is of the education today, where liberal arts and fine arts are losing ground in education. How important this was in forming Christina, and what the generations of today actually can lose the power of shaping their world. Thank you very much. Eric, last one out. He's in his 20s. I have to say that. But isn't that interesting? How he is... Someone in his 20s spent years reading and writing about Christina. I think that's a lesson as well, how fascinating she is. So having opted your age, go ahead.
Yes. Do you hear me in this? Yeah, this one's much better. Yeah. When Christina was born on the 8th of December 1626, the world was in many aspects very different from ours today, and that we have to remember, I think. She was born as daughter of Gustav Adolf, who was the only male member of the Vasa dynasty, or at least the Vasa dynasty in Sweden. There was a part in Poland, as you know. And he was very eager to have an heir to the throne. His wife, Maria Eleonora, had given birth at least one time, as we know, and she had a daughter then, also called Christina, and she died at only 1 or 2 years of age. And she also had at least 2 miscarriages. So when it was announced that Maria Eleonora was pregnant once again, everybody hoped that this was a prince that would give the Vasas an heir to the throne, of course. And at first, when Christina was born, the women who took care of her also thought that this was the case. Christina has written about this event. Of course, she couldn't remember it herself, but she has been taught about this later on. And Christina wrote that she had a very strong voice and that she was covered with hair. And this led the women that took care of her to the false conclusion that she actually was a boy. And she also writes, and that is very important, I think, that the only person who did not care that she was a girl was her father, Gustav Adolf. And he said from the very beginning on that that Christina should be raised as a prince, that they should make no difference. And for example, at a visit in Kalmar in southern parts of Sweden, when she was only 2 years old, he got the question if they should not fire these cannons for a salute when the small princess Christina was present. But he only said that she had to learn because she was the daughter of a soldier. Yes, so this was Christina's beginning and first years. And when she was only 6 years of age, as we all know, her father died in the Battle of Lützen in Germany. And her education, of course, was very forced, and a government was formed that should rule the country until she became of age to rule by herself. And the main figure in this government was the chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna. And he wrote a new form of government for Sweden. And he said that this was accepted by the king while he still lived. But we only have Axel Oxenstierna's own word for this. So we don't know actually if this is true. And this was the new foundation for how the kingdom should be ruled. And it contained 5 noblemen that should rule the kingdom until Christina got of age. Yes. And for Christina, her childhood was very, of course, dramatic, and she has written how she fled to the studies from her grieving mothers. The mother was in her room all days, and the court didn't have any place for her, and she had very few others that were her age at the court. But she had a great teacher. His name was Johannes Matti, and he was very radical at this time, and he thought that all Christian churches should lay all differences aside. And he pointed out that the major war that was going on in Germany was a religious one, the 30 Years' War, as we all know. And this was due to the religious conflict So, Christina had this very radical teacher of hers. And she also learned all the things a prince should manage to do, as be able to ride a horse, of course, fight with a sword. And she learned other stuff like fortification and war strategies. And she learned history. This was as part of her political education. And her educator in this field was, of course, no one else than Axel Oxenstierna himself. When Christina was 18, she was pronounced of age to rule on her own. And she had learned from this great master. And the first thing that she didn't do was that she did not sign this form of government that Axel Oxenstierna had written. And this meant that she had almost all power in her own hands at only the age of 18. And she, of course, had to listen to what her advisors said, but she didn't have to follow what they said if she didn't want to. Soon enough, she realized that she wanted something else than to rule Sweden for the rest of her life. She could not get married without having to deal with the power struggle of the marriage. At this point of time in history, the husband was always the leader in the marriage of the couple. And this meant that she would have to step down from the leading role in the marriage. And this was not something that she could accept. Her destiny from birth was to rule, so she said also. And of course this became a major conflict for her as well, being a woman in this system that was formed for men. And after just a few years on the throne, she explained her position. She had a successor pointed out, her cousin, Carl Gustav, as we heard her before. And she said that he could lead Sweden in battle if necessary. And he could also form a new strong dynasty, which she couldn't. And the Vasa dynasty would end with her. And of course, she motivated it with the motive that Sweden needed this man, this male figure, to lead the country. She didn't think that she could manage this role. And also, which is very important, I think, she mentioned her own longing for freedom. And this is a key point, I think, for her own motivation to leaving the throne. And what can we learn from this today? I think most of all the importance of education and skilled teachers. We have, as I pointed out, this Johannes Matti, even in this time he was very radical. And I think that was very important for Christina. And he gave her much input on how she could live her life. And also she had input that she would never have with another teacher. And also I think she learns us that it is very important to follow what you really want at heart, and not necessarily what you're destined for or what the role that you're born to decides for you. thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Erik, for the insight in Christina's early years and how she was formed. And all your presentations create so many what-if questions with me. And I know I'm in the royal castle, but so excuse me for being blunt, but what if? What if a monarch of today changed their religion to Catholicism? What if a monarch of today would be homosexual? What if?
I'm not that familiar with monarchies, as we long ago lost the tradition, luckily, of monarchies. But we could ask the question, what is if a modern politician is homosexual? And what, again, we could see, so where I have the cases of Germany and Austria I'm most familiar with, that it's much easier nowadays for male politicians to get out of the closet. So in Germany we have quite a few. I don't know, I'm not familiar with other countries. But for women it's still not that easy to get out of the closet and saying, oh, well, I'm lesbian and I'm a politician in power. And I think this is still interesting also with this sexual troubles that, of course you could say, well, it's not that interesting which sexual orientation, for instance, a politician or a monarch has. Although it gets more and more, it gets more to the public, so it's not a private issue. That's what I mean with the notion of the two bodies of a public person or of a politician. They get more and more merged, or they collapse into another. And so what I think it's still interesting that whenever you look what has to do with sex or with gender or with sexual orientation in politics, that we still have the difference between how men are perceived and how women are perceived. So.
Let's move to the education question. What would happen if Queen Christina would form our education today? Would we have war strategy? Would we have 8 languages in school? Would we have liberal arts? What would we have? And great teachers, I assume.
Great teacher, of course.
Yeah.
And of course more languages, I think. And of course to speak the languages, that was important in her position. It wasn't to write. She was awful at spelling. For instance, she wrote French all her life, and yeah, it's not that easy to read today. But and history, I think. She was very fond of history. She always read Tacitus and all the antique writers and so on. So history and languages, I think she preferred best.
Well, the language aspect, of course, then it's, as you say, especially the spoken word, which was important. Christina had, of course, several secretaries writing for her, so she didn't really need to to write completely correct in every language she wrote. It was so many, but spoken capacities in all the languages she spoke must have been. Well, Chanu says that she speaks as if she was she had been brought up at the Louvre. So, well, there is of course an homage and a praise in those words, but we have no doubt to believe they are true.
So let's go to the power issue. What role did this? I know we've been into this many times today, but if you could elaborate, maybe Birgit, on the power issue and gender, and Christina.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's difficult to add something what I said before, but maybe I can give some more variations. I think if we look at it, we had the discussion this morning of symbolizing Europe. So we are also dealing with the question, so what is power in Europe? And how can we symbolize, I would say, if Europe is a democracy, then we should somehow symbolize the sovereignty of the people. Then, of course, we have to look how did power develop. And I think, of course, when saying, well, the 17th century was the start for a rearrangement, for restructuring power and power relations. And Christina was all within these power troubles, and she was on one hand playing the power game, and as you said, maybe she was also suffering from it. And I think what you brought in, this notion of freedom, I think we have to carefully think about it. So what is freedom, for instance, in relation to power, and what did it mean also for Christina? Couldn't it be the case also that she said, well, I have the freedom to exercise power? I'm not familiar as you with her biography, but what I was reading was, I had the impression she also thought it's a way of freedom to being in power. So, but it's always the ambivalence. And then I would say, if we look then at gender and power today and under European conditions, we really have to carefully look what could be the way to, on the one hand, democracy, also to equality and freedom. So I think this is, maybe equality wasn't that the question at Christina's time, but I would say this is the question, the broader question of gender in politics, of women in politics today. How can we look at equality on the one hand, freedom on the other hand, and what is then, what does power at this very special moment then mean? So it's more a question, it's not an answer.
Thank you. Do any of you have any questions? Yes.
I try to be very positive, but you have the cases of daughters of big men, like Alice Putto and Lydia Gandhi, and they were both killed. They didn't abdicate. Could I have a little commentary on this?
Anyone?
Yeah, I'll try.
I think it's a kind of pattern I try to...
Yeah. I don't know if the killing makes a pattern, but what is clear is that that for women, we're trying, political science, we're trying to make typologies. What are the routes, the ways of women, for instance, coming to power? And then you have modern democracies, party democracies, where you could see, well, you have to go into the party, and then sometime you go up the ladder, and then you're lucky to have this position. Or you have the other way, saying, well, you're coming out of a dynastic tradition, and so the daughters of big men, they took more of this dynastic road. Today we have a third road saying, well, we have quota systems. So, yeah, it's not a sort of meritocracy, because meritocracy doesn't work, but aristocracy maybe worked at that time, being a daughter of a great man. So in modern democracies, we have the other way. And, well, there was also a very sad case in Sweden of killing of female politicians. So I wouldn't say that this is the pattern, but it could be, yeah.
Yes.
You can't hear me. Oh dear. I'm Margit Wallsten, and I'm dealing mostly with European issues. I'm looking at your book here, Erik Pettersson, The Power Player. You have a subtitle. Why this subtitle? Queen Elizabeth's Revolt.
Yes, I think she revolts against the system built by men, mostly, by Axel Oxenstierna, by even her father, and she doesn't fit this role, I think. And of course, revolt is kind of a strong word to use, but I use it so that one will be able to see what she really does and how strategic she is on her way to what she wants. And I especially think that her not signing this form of government is one way of really revolting against the system. So,
Erik, what do you think was her drive? What was her motive? She could have stayed just a symbolic monarch. What was her drive to take power?
I think it's very difficult to see.
Of course, 300 years ago, yeah.
But I think that she wanted this freedom that she could not have in Sweden. And we had a different climate of thoughts, and she wanted another sphere, culturally, of course, and intellectually. So, and she just could not find that in Sweden at the time. And I think that was the drive, the motivation for her personally. And of course, also that she could not deal with this gap between her biological side, that she really was a woman. They have actually seen her body in Rome to see if she really was a and it's horrible that they had to do that, but it says something about how strong this notion of her not being a real woman is, as you said. So and the gap between her biological role and the role of the ruler, the king. She was crowned as King of Sweden, and of course this was something that she could not deal with in a proper way, as long as she was king. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Ellie Foster from Innsbruck, but the question is, she was not the only ruler in Europe who was female. And of course, this was 100 years later. From Austria, we always think of Maria Theresia, of course. And she also, of course, was crowned as a king of Hungary because it was no other possibility. But she ruled the Austrian lands. On the other hand, of course, she had children, she was married, and her husband was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but he did that. She was the ruler in the Austrian lands. So I don't think it's such a gap. Perhaps it's another situation in Sweden, but throughout Europe there were more female rulers.
Of course, and in England we have Queen Elizabeth, and she was not married and didn't have children of her own, but she had also other ways of dealing with this problem. She said that she was married with the state of England. Yeah, of course, but I think it's a question of her personality and the way she was brought up into this system. And she was very, so to speak, I don't know, how should I put it? She obeyed the rules very, very much so. And she says that it was very important for Sweden to have a male figure. I don't know if Austria was at war during Maria Theresia's time, but she said that one of the main things that she could not do was go to war, and this was a male thing to do. And yeah, I don't know if that was important for her, maybe.
Stefano?
Just a brief comment. It is important to see, I think, this definite and important rupture at the time of the abdication, of course. It is a completely different situation. She lives in Rome and in Italy, but still it is important, I think, even to see the continuity in her life, because Christina keeps being a political person in Rome. She is very much involved in the election of the popes. She retails a political role for herself. She tries to settle peace between Spain and France. So I would say that she was not retreating in any way. This was maybe what some parts of Europe expected from her. She converted. She could have been a nun. She could have. There were rumors about that she would move to Madrid and enter a monastery. So this is important, I think, to keep in mind that there is a continuity. The rupture is important. She leaves Sweden. She leaves the reign, but still she keeps being a queen all her life, and that is an aspect that really characterizes her life.
Thank you. One last question.
Yes, Stefano, you said that she was. You said that she was compensating for her regency with putting up a cultural court, which I think is interesting, given that she actually says that the Salic law of the Franks were correct, that women shouldn't rule. And she also has a maxim saying that being a woman is the most embarrassing condition you can be in. And women shouldn't rule because they make themselves ridiculous. This is very harsh words, of course, on her own self. I believe they were written after the chances for her to gain absolute power was over, after the Polish election. But I think you actually answered this by saying that the cultural element was something that she compensated for her platform with, so that she could keep her kingly, spiritual kingly status. Because also she sought out Anna Maria von Schurman in Utrecht, who had written a book called Can a Christian Woman Be Learned? Where this particular problem, can a woman have a male mind and be accepted in a Christian culture? And Anna Maria von Schurman, who knew several languages, including Coptic and Arabic, she was probably the friend of Claude Saumaise, the French scholar who was in Stockholm. She actually says a woman can learn anything, take part in all the arts, all the sciences, but she shouldn't combine this with taking a political role. So this is a position that apparently was in swing among European women at the time, that they thought they could develop mentally, but they were very afraid of taking the actual power position. It's an interesting transitional position, and I think Christina probably was influenced by this. Although she tried to gain political power, but of course she failed. And maybe she actually met Anna Maria von Schurman, they discussed. And it must have been this book that they, at least one of the topics were concerning this.
Thank you.
Yes, you can, of course, I think it is possible to see Christina's life as due to the fact that after moving to Rome, actually she builds up this court where culture becomes her land, her reign, her sovereign space. So, and we have notices also some kind of tiring aspect of reigning here in Sweden. She had this this illness, probably for studying too much, getting up too early in the mornings and studying and then taking care of the affairs of the state. So I think, well, it's difficult to sort out exactly, and probably we can just end up with the hypothesis. But I think that the two aspects, the political one and the cultural one, are so intermingled at the time that it's almost impossible to divide them. I don't think we should. It's our way of seeing things today. The two were very much the same for them, and especially for Christina. This is my opinion.
Thank you very much. I think that my takeaway from this symposium is, when it comes to power and gender and age, is that you can argue and fight for for women's rights, for young rights, younger people's rights to vote, for example. But you can also fight for power by being young, by being of the wrong gender, and having power, getting power, and using it instead of just arguing, but by being young and being woman, as Christina did. I want to thank you on behalf of the Gender Committee, to Denis and to the French Embassy and Cultural Institute that we could have this seminar today. And I also want to thank your participants, Stefano, Erik, and Birgit, that you shared your thoughts today. And thank you for being inside, despite that Sweden is actually sunny today. So thank you.
Thank you, Lena. We invite now Elinor for the next speech.
Okay, so actually there's not so much to say about Christina and Austria, so the following are a few remarks. We have now talked a lot about Christina's importance for Europe, and to pick out one country in particular, so in this case Austria, but it would be interesting to do it also with the other countries. So in this case it can make sense because Christina officially converted from Protestantism to Catholicism in Innsbruck in 1655, after she had done so in secret in Belgium beforehand. So we can ask if this country perhaps has a special memory of Christina. Has the place where she converted become a lieu de mémoire for the city of Innsbruck or for the state of the Tyrol, where Innsbruck is situated? Innsbruck is the capital of the Tyrol, or for the whole of Austria. And Austria, of course, then and now are different things, so it changed very much. We already know that, so one explanation, since Christina intended to go to Rome, the Pope insisted that she converts officially. So she did so on the way to Rome, in one of the first appropriate Catholic cities, that is Innsbruck. Residing in Innsbruck at that time was a branch of the Habsburgs, and that is the family of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is the one who had to answer for the outcome of the 30 Years' War and the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. We've already heard about that. And one has, of course, to consider that the 30 Years' War was more a political than a religious war, even if the different religions were often used as arguments. They finally became confirmed by the peace treaty, but the fact that Sweden, beside France, was one of the big winners of the war and gained influence in the Holy Roman Empire weighed more heavily than the fact that it was a Protestant country. So I, for myself, or from the historical view, I would not stress the fact too much that Christina's conversion was a triumph for the emperor because Sweden remained the major power as it had been before. However, the situation was suitable for exploitation, above all by the church. But I think one have to look through propaganda at that time. For the court in Innsbruck, the arrival and stay of Christina in 1655 was first and foremost one thing, and this is a huge event. If one thoroughly reads about the preparations, then one gets the impression that the whole country worked together to make the celebration as grand as possible. Behind that, there was of course the enthusiasm of the time to arrange big Baroque festivities, and especially the enthusiasm of the Tyrolean ruler, Archduke Ferdinand Karl. It was a time of strong influence, of strong Italian influence, with a fascination for operas. In Innsbruck or throughout Europe, Ferdinand Karl had had 2 theaters built in the years before, and there were many foreign artists at court. So the conversion of Christina in the Chapel Royal, the Hofkirche, was embedded in a whole number of smaller and larger celebrations. Among these, there was, for example, the first performance of the opera La Gia by Pietro Antonio Cesti during Christina's stay. And that is exactly the context in which Christina is remembered most in the history and memories of the Tyrol today. No general historians write about her much, if at all. But for music historians, she and her stay are often mentioned because she was the occasion for this big musical event. If general historians wrote about Christina, she and her stay in Innsbruck had to serve as a means of taking a close look at court life. The preparation, as I said, of the festivities had been a big logistical challenge and had therefore produced a lot of source material, which historians could and can use to describe the court at that time. So Christina herself did not seem very interesting, but almost only the events she triggered with her stay. Only a few years ago, in 2005, a memorial plaque was installed in the Chapel Royal, saying, of course in German, "In this church, Queen Christina of Sweden converted officially to the Catholic faith on the 3rd of November in 1655. But this, so the memorial plaque, happened not because of the initiatives of the city that perhaps wanted to remember a part of its history, nor because of the church that could have used this fact for emphasizing the importance of the Catholic faith. It originally happened because of Swedes who are living in Innsbruck, and especially because of two Swedish city guides. Because Christina's stay in Innsbruck is, of course, one of the most important things they want to talk about and now also show to Swedish tourists. It was not easy to get approval for this plaque through, although, as I said, one could think that the city and the church would appreciate this sign of internationality on the one hand and of Catholicism on the other. However, there's another fact to consider. This Chapel Royal is a special memorial site in Tyrolean history. It was erected in the 16th century as a burial place for Emperor Maximilian I. He himself was a great strategist of public relations. During his lifetime, he wrote books about his adventures and at the same time, of course, about his greatness. Many buildings in the city of Innsbruck, where he spent much time even after he had become emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, still show this intention to present himself as a great ruler. And he planned his burial place, inspired by the burial places of Burgundy. This was, of course, no coincidence. Maximilian's first marriage was to Maria of Burgundy. These tombs of Philip the Good and Isabella of Bourbon, for example, already had figures accompanying the deceased, and Maximilian now wanted to have 40 cast iron, gilded, taller than head-high figures on both sides of his planned sarcophagus. But when he died, there were only a few figures ready, and because the whole venture was very expensive, it finally took about 60 years until his grandson could complete the burial place. Not as monumental as Maximilian had planned. No gold on the figures and only 28 of them. But it is still quite impressive. Even if Maximilian himself is not lying there, so it's only a cenotaph, because shortly before he died he had troubles with his hosts in Innsbruck. His debts to them were so high, resulting from years of not paying the costs for the billeting of his tenants. So he decided not to be buried there. Briefly speaking, this Chapel Royal is dominated by his memorial, filling the whole central nave and a part of the sanctuary. When there were special festive services in history, all the figures held a burning candle in their hands. So we can imagine that this was probably also impressive for Christina when she went into the church in 1655. However, coming back to the question of a memorial, at the beginning of the 19th century, this church got an added memorial in the only remaining space that was left, the entrance area. I do not want to go too much into detail and history, but to understand the status of Christina's memory, a few remarks are necessary. The year of 1809 holds an extraordinary place in Tyrolean history. There was an insurrection against the Bavarian government to whom the Tyrol belonged for a few years during the Napoleonic Wars. There was one leading person. History called him a freedom fighter very uncritically for a long time, whose importance became greater and greater the longer time went on. So his burial place is also in the Chapel Royal with a big monument. He was originally shot in Mantua, but later officers exhumed his bones and brought them to Innsbruck. With this, I wanted to show how symbolic this area is, where Christina's memorial plaque has been installed. And therefore, you can hardly see it when you enter the church. It is near the side altar where she converted to the Catholic faith. So it is up to time and to communication as to whether and how Christina will actually be able to challenge the two male persons commemorated here. However, looking a bit further afield at the German-speaking countries, interest in Christina's life was something that did not diminish throughout the centuries. Every now and then a book or an article about her was published, but of course the perspective of the writing changed. Writing about her started even during her lifetime, as we know, and continued after her death. It is, I think, really amazing that this interest in her never really ceased. It seemed very strong in the 17th and 18th centuries, but did not stop during the 19th and 20th centuries. We've already heard a lot about the controversial views held of her. They changed between admiring her for her interest in philosophy and sciences on the one hand, and declaring her as unfeminine and unable to rule on the other hand. Almost all the publications are based on original documents that are not only referred to, but historians reprinted them page after page. And of course, this is convincing and seems to be the reality. So with this range of impressions, it was always very easy to select the one thing that just fitted for a certain context. Also, the women's movement around 1900 in Vienna made reference to her. As in Germany too, and probably in other countries, the women's movement in Austria was divided into different groups. Catholic women, perhaps, could have appreciated the conversion of Christina, but never her self-determined life. And also the middle-class women's movement had troubles dealing with Christina. On the one hand, Christina could have been a good role model for them, a woman who was queen, an important person, who had a very good education and mixed with famous philosophers, but she did not fit into the norms of womanhood. This part of the women's movement was fighting for more rights in employment, law, and especially suffrage. But they did not appreciate women who revolted against the traditional role of women. So only the social democratic women's movement remained. There was one article written by a social democratic woman about Christina in the Neue Freie Presse, an important daily newspaper at that time, but not until 1926. So this date was the 300th anniversary of Christina's birthday. And at that time, when the blossoming of the women's movement was already mostly over. And so in the article, Christina is outlined as an interesting woman, but it emphasizes that the wrong education was responsible for Christina's strange life. This emphasis on education, of course, is typical of that time. So in summary, normally a person is suitable to be considered a hero if one does not know much about him or her, because then there are many blank spaces to fill with the necessary or wanted values. In Christina's case, there seems to be very much we know at first sight. But when we look again, we do not know much very in detail. And this uncertainty, combined of course with her glittering life, makes her suitable for different, almost arbitrary interpretations. So from my point of view, it's important, very important, to recount her history as completely as possible and to embed her history in the historical context and not to single out some aspects. Otherwise, the arbitrary misinterpretations will go on and on. Thank you.
Any question?
I think you pointed out a very important issue, namely that there hasn't been written a really good historiography of Queen Christina, due to the fact probably that she's a Swede in Italy, a Roman citizen, with Swedish historians following her far away from the archives in Rome and so on. Which means that there is no national authority that can somehow underline or undescribe such a full biography yet. But this is something for the future. And also the historiographic aspect is very important, how she has been seen throughout the years. And you pointed out that in Austria, the various aspects of Christina that could be latched onto differ from various groups. And I think this will probably be the case even in the future, that different groups see different things in her. And this is, of course, an asset in many ways, if the full story can be laid out. But I believe it has to do with something with her mobility. There is no clear institution that has a responsibility for her, not even in Sweden, because she's so far away.
Yeah, thank you very much for underlining this. And so that's therefore I appreciate your work. I haven't read it, but you are combining the looking into the Italian sources and the Swedish sources. And this is highly necessary because, of course, we all know that it's so necessary to look very critically at the source material, because I think Eric mentioned that she herself wrote about her being a child with all this hair. If there are no other source material, of course she was constructing her own personality. And so I think it's all running through the fingers, dealing with the source material.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you as well, as Susanna did, for you pointed out, I think, a feature that is really important to bear in mind, that probably these different Christinas we have, they are obviously, naturally, a consequence of her own acting during her lifetime, but also to the fact that, as Susanna said, she's been moving through the countries, and the problem also that there seems to be these blank spaces, as you said, that are open for different interpretations. And that is why it's so important, as you said. Well, this is just most a comment to what you said, but it is really important to look at the sources, to try to be as accurate as possible, and not to take up the challenge she gives us as scholars, to follow her route, to follow her different languages, to follow her different interests. I mean, I've been writing about poetry, but I suddenly discovered that I should at least have some kind of knowledge in alchemy, just to give, and that is not easy. It's not easy to have an idea of what it is about. So that is a challenge, but if you try to follow a path, a lot is given in reward, because then what really opens is a really universalistic approach to culture, where she still, and I think probably me and Susanna, we agree on that, I hope, that she maybe looks more back in time than further on. She's a true Renaissance patron of the arts, taking into consideration classical languages, modern languages, poetry, art, music, and at the same time practicing. Well, not all of them, of course, but as we heard this morning, at least trying to write and trying to express herself in an artistical manner. Well, it wasn't really a question, just a comment. But
Yeah, thank you for that.
Any question?
We musicians, we create international societies, and that's a good tool for many things. So why don't we create a Queen Christina society, international society? Now, with internet, it's so easy to have an internet society. We can all have our addresses and we can speak daily about so many things. We must come together around Queen Christina. And of course, my aim is to force you to assist us into recreating those terribly fascinating ballets de cour, which are the illustration of what life was in those days. I wrote a wonderful article in our deceased review Artus about this, and I quoted Baldassare Castiglione, Il Cortegiano, in 1528, when he said that it was obvious that all people needed to be able to dance. And this is what sort of characterized society in those days. Those who couldn't dance couldn't go to a fine society. It was part of the education. We have lost so much in education, we know. And we musicians, we know now how to perform the music exactly the way it was done in those days. We are looking for choreographers who could do the same thing. We have big books on how to dance and so on. So a Christina society would bring us together next time, and we should have a Fredsarvel ballet performance of leading people. Heartily welcome.
Thank you for this wonderful idea. So, you have question? No. In this case, Elinor, thank you very much. It was very interesting to know something about Christine in Austria. And thank you. It was a very nice day. I hope for you too. Thank you to everybody, to all the participants, to the public. And I wish you a good weekend. Goodbye.